Bad dialogue will destroy your story.
That's right, Peter. I'm you and you're me. And this is a gun.
So in this video, I'll be analyzing good and bad fantasy dialogue from Lord of the Rings, Eragon, The Rings of Power, and a bunch of other fantasy stories, all to help you write better dialogue in your fantasy novel. And I'll also be joined by some special guests to help with this analysis later in the video, so make sure you stick around for that. To begin with, what defines bad fantasy dialogue? I think there's 6 key markers of bad fantasy dialogue, and the first one is that it is on the nose. As Robin Russin and William Downes say, when a character states exactly what he wants, it's called on-the-nose dialogue. There is no hidden meaning behind the words, no secret want, because everything is spelled out. But most interesting people, and certainly most interesting characters, don't do this. Number 2, bad dialogue has repeated beats. You want to avoid repeating the same statements or emotions. Instead, each line of dialogue should aim to move your story forward. Number 3, the as you know setup. When two characters explain things to each other that both of them already know, it feels fake and artificial. Number 4, bad dialogue uses convoluted language. Sometimes in our efforts to produce memorable dialogue, us writers can get carried away with complicated phrasing and extravagant word choice. And this can again produce a fake feeling that yanks readers out of your fantasy world. Number 5, bad dialogue uses contrived setups. This occurs when you make one character say something purely to give another character an opportunity to respond with this zinger or this one-liner or some cool turn of phrase that you developed. Now, this can be done well, but oftentimes it creates a certain shattering of the reader's suspension of disbelief because it reminds them of the constructed and artificial nature of your story. And then lastly, number 6, bad fantasy dialogue uses info dumping. Particularly when writing fantasy novels, dialogue is a very tempting tool that you might want to reach for when it comes to describing your world, your magic, your politics, your setting, your history, and all these other unique elements that you have created for your story. Now, of course, this can work, but when over-relied upon and used for the benefit of your reader, rather than as a natural expression of what your characters would actually say to one another in that situation, it will again pull readers out of your story. Okay, so those are some traits of bad fantasy dialogue. Let's take a look at some traits of good fantasy dialogue, and then we'll get to analyzing a few different fantasy scenes to see this in action. Number 1, good fantasy dialogue progresses plot. Dialogue is verbal action. It is a tool characters use to get what they want. So as a fantasy writer, you should always be thinking about how each line of dialogue moves the story forward, deepens your characters, and enriches your themes. Number 2, great fantasy dialogue uses subtext. As Robert McKee says, great dialogue operates on 3 levels. Number 1, the said are those ideas and emotions a character chooses to express to others. Number 2, the unsaid are those thoughts and feelings a character expresses in an inner voice, but only to himself. And then lastly, number 3, the unsayable are those subconscious urges and desires a character cannot express in words, even to himself, because they are mute and beyond awareness. So the said is text, and then the unsaid and the unsayable are subtext. Number 3, good fantasy dialogue builds character personality and uniqueness. Your dialogue should be so personalized to each character that you could just take a random line of dialogue from anywhere in your book, strip it of the dialogue tag, show it to your reader, and the reader should know which character is speaking. When you can do that, it means you have achieved a good level of uniqueness with your dialogue. Number 4, great fantasy dialogue conveys information and world building in a natural seeming way. Notice that I say natural seeming because good dialogue is not realistic. Realistic dialogue is filled with ums and ahs and pauses and stutters and trailed off sentences and random segues and a ton of messiness. You don't actually want that in your story. Instead, you want something that feels like it could come from reality while avoiding all the pitfalls of real dialogue. And then lastly, number 5, good dialogue writers recognize that dialogue is almost a last resort. Of course, that's not a hard and fast rule, but dialogue shouldn't always be the first tool you reach for when it comes to conveying emotion, information, and characterization. If you can make readers understand that your character is afraid through description or through symbolism or through imagery or through sort of immersing us within their internal state with the tone that you're using to describe the world around them, that is always going to be more impactful than just having a character say, "I'm scared." Pixar calls this the 2+2 rule. Essentially, the idea here is that you don't want to tell characters that 2 + 2 = 4 You want to just give them 2 + 2 and have them work out for themselves that it equals 4. When you do that, when you make them actually interpret the information you're giving them, it produces a much deeper connection with your story. So those are a few signs of good versus bad fantasy dialogue. In a moment, we're going to start applying this framework by analyzing some fantasy scenes. But first, I thought it would be interesting if I asked a few of my story coaching clients what they consider to be good dialogue.
It needs to sound natural, and it needs to move the story forward and kind of organically.
I like to be 80% more active than passive, and then also 80% more concrete than really abstract. And what I really try to focus on is not saying things, not having my characters say things that the reader already knows.
Anything that draws you into the story, where bad dialogue is anything that takes you out of it.
Now let's analyze the opening scene from The Rings of Power. And as we go through this scene, think about all the principles we've just discussed when it comes to what defines good versus bad dialogue.
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? Because the stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible. The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under. But the ship has a secret. For unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up, fixed upon the light that guides her, whispering of grander things than darkness ever knew.
I think it was too long. The brother pontificates a little too much and repeats himself quite frequently.
I agree. I feel like if it was 80% shorter, it could actually be good.
Something else should be happening outside. Like them just sitting in a field is so boring.
That would be an instant way to improve this, is if they were actually doing something a bit more dynamic than just sitting in a field. It is stretching for this like sort of grand mythic feeling with all of these allusions to like light and shadow and darkness. But at this point in the story, we haven't really seen anything that justifies talking at that scale. All that really happened before this scene is that this young girl like had her friends throw a stone at her little paper boat that was floating down the river, and it sunk and she's sad. And that can definitely lead to an interesting character building moment between her and an older brother, but it just doesn't feel like it justifies the grandiosity that they're going for here.
Yeah, I completely agree. It feels like something that they're talking about just for the viewer to hear. It doesn't feel like a conversation that would naturally occur.
Our next scene is from the Chronicles of Narnia. In this scene, Edmund is a regular boy from our world who stumbles into the fairy tale world of Narnia.
And how, Edmund, did you come to enter my dominion?
I'm not sure. I was just following my sister.
Your sister? How many are you?
4. Lucy's the only one that's been here before.
Edmund, you look so cold. Come and sit with me. Now, how about something hot to drink?
Yes, please. Your Majesty. How did you do that?
I can make anything you like.
Can you make me taller?
Anything you'd like to eat. Edmund, I would very much like to meet the rest of your family.
Why? They're nothing special.
Oh, I'm sure they're not nearly as delightful as you are. But you see, Edmund, I have no children of my own. And you are exactly the sort of boy who I could see one day becoming Prince of Narnia. Of course, you'd have to bring a family.
Oh, do you mean Peter would be king too?
No. But a king needs servants.
They're short sentences and they go back and forth, right? It's not just one character sitting there talking endlessly, as we saw in the first scene, which can be kind of boring. It sounds organic, it sounds natural, and it also moves the story forward, right?
It's the multifaceted nature of this thing, right? Because it is seamlessly blending like world building. It's establishing the White Witch's magic and her power. It's also establishing, Edmund's character flaws and his resentment towards his siblings. There's also all of the manipulation that the White Queen is doing, and you get a sense that she's kind of like this quite formidable adversary. It's like blending 3 or 4 or even 5 different aspects of story and sort of seamlessly weaving them into one.
Absolutely. So yeah, so we covered everything, right? World building, magic introduction, character building, and then also we built up our villain a little bit.
Next, let's look at the ending scene from Eragon.
You lost those who were dear to you. You've paid a great price for your courage.
Did you know the people of the Barden already tell stories about you?
The legend of Eragon, the great shade slayer, spreads throughout Allegatia.
You know how legends go. People will believe just about anything these days. When will I see you again?
Time moves quickly. Only yesterday you were a farm boy. Today you are a hero. Tomorrow, may see us together again.
What do you think?
It gives me a lot of confidence in myself as a writer. You know, if that film got green-lighted with that draft of the screenplay, then, you know, anyone can make it. It was just so on the nose. Let's say all of these like subconscious things out loud, because, you know, people do that.
All the emotion and the hidden meaning is all on the surface here, as you say. There's nothing to discover, there's nothing to uncover or to work out as a reader, and that's why it feels so wooden and just on the nose. There would be so much more strength to this if all of those phrases around like, oh, you're a hero, or you've come a long way from being a farm boy. There is an interesting way to get that across, but if you're directly stating it on the surface of the dialogue, it's probably not going to work. Like, that's stuff that you need to have them talking about something else, and then deep down beneath the surface, they're actually talking about the fact that Eragon feels worried about what's next, or that he can't believe everything that's happened to him on his journey so far, or that, you know, she is trying to tell him that you are actually worthy of the stories people are telling about you. But the fact that it's just all out on the surface and there's no hidden meaning makes for a very weak scene.
I think most good dialogue is invisible, where you just like don't notice that they're even talking. You're just focusing on the relationships between the characters or what's about to happen next, because it's supposed to flow organically because you're just watching people interact.
It's a good approach to consider dialogue as the weapon of last resort, where it's like the only time when you want to use dialogue to convey character emotion, for example, is when it's not clear within the description or within the internal feelings you're describing, or just within the subtext of the story itself. And as soon as you are relying on dialogue to get key things across, it does produce that quality you're talking about, where it feels like it's now drawing attention to itself. And that's why it's so important as well to be reading your dialogue out loud, and just to be thinking about, is this how people would actually speak in this situation, or does it feel convoluted? Does it sound like I'm trying to be too clever?
For our last scene, we're going to analyze Eragon's speech before the Battle of the Black Gate, which is one of my all-time favorite fantasy moments. As we lead into this, I thought I'd first ask Michael and Lewis about the best dialogue lessons they've learned from working with me.
Michael, what's been the most useful dialogue lesson you've learned from the story coaching program?
You help me see how the reader perceives my characters, and you also help me see how my other characters perceive each other. And once I got a better understanding of their goals and their ghosts, I suppose, the dialogue just flowed from there. Every line of dialogue now I feel helps push the story forward in some way.
The biggest lesson for me has been making my dialogue more concise. I tend to have my characters repeat themselves too much, and I didn't notice, and so you really helped point that out, and it's something that I'm really conscious about now. And then back to like we just discussed, adding dialogue beats or action beats in with your sentences to actually create more dialogue without using characters speaking.
Inside my story coaching program, we look at all the different aspects of fantasy storytelling, whether that's dialogue, world building, plot, characterization, theme, all the other aspects that go into crafting a successful story. That's what we cover in the story coaching program. In the story coaching program, I draw from my experience of publishing 3 fantasy books and a best-selling video game, and I'll be reading through your story, giving you targeted, tailored feedback to help you elevate your fantasy storytelling to the next level. You can apply using the link in the description down below, or by going to jedherne.com/coaching. I will warn you that last time I mentioned this program in one of my YouTube videos, I think I got about 20 or 30 applicants within the space of 2 days, and I only had the capacity to take on 3 new clients. With this program, you're getting a lot of my personal time and attention, so I only work with a very small number of people at once. So really try to put a lot of effort into crafting the best application that you possibly can, and hopefully we'll be working together at some point in the future. Our next scene is Eragon's speech at the Battle of the Black Gate in Lord of the Rings.
Hold your ground! Hold your ground! Sons of Gondor! Of Rohan! My brothers! I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West!
I just finished the speech.
Awesome. What do you think?
I was just trying not to cry, man. It's so good.
Oh man, I got chills just watching it again. It's too good. I love the way he starts the speech talking about himself and how he feels the fear, and then he talks about his men, and then he expands to the age of men. It's something that the reader, or the watcher in this case, can feel in themselves when they see or hear those words. Everybody feels some sort of fear, so I think it's perfect.
Yeah, I think he does a really good job of elevating this confrontation to this very mythic and grand level. This is a battle for the very soul of Middle Earth, and it's a fight to see whether us like weak kind of mortal men have the courage to face this ever-present darkness, and despite that darkness find a degree of hope. It does a really great job of just infusing the story with this sense of epic grandeur, which I think is something that is a very unique property and skill that epic fantasy can do, because you are able to genuinely have the stakes be this high. And when you ground that within a world that has, you know, these really flawed, complicated characters that you can connect to, it just creates like this amazing kind of symbiosis between it, because you've got this character you can relate to, and then the stakes they're facing could not be higher. And that's almost like the perfect combination when you can make it work.
Couldn't agree more.
For Frodo.